Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. There's a lot going on in the world, and I think that this book is very relevant. It just came out recently, and we have the author. Her name is Phyllis Pomerantz. She put out a book called Foreign Aid, Policy and Practice. So there it is right there. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Well, as you know, the world is in turmoil. There's a lot of chaos, but there's a lot of foreign aid being given out. So let's begin with the origin of the book. Why did you write this?
I wrote the book exactly because the world is at a inflection point in some ways where things are changing, and we need to review the kinds of support and assistance we're giving to countries. And I wrote the book because I found in all the discussions about foreign aid that people really didn't know the basics. So people are talking about apples and oranges. When somebody says, oh, I hate foreign aid, and somebody says, I love foreign aid, usually they're not even talking about the same thing. So, yeah, crazy. So that's why I wrote the book, is to sort of give people the basics and then go on to talk about all the controversies and all of the issues involved with it, because it is a very problematic topic, as most people know.
Yeah, and your background, it seems like you have been in this game quite a bit. Or you're a professor, you've studied this stuff. Tell us a little bit about your history.
Yeah, well, I've been looking at foreign aid and international development for over 40 years. I hesitate to say. I did early work in the field in Latin America, and then I joined the World Bank, and for 26 years traveled over the world, around the world, helping governments do development projects. And then I became a professor of international development at Duke. And I wrote this book really just after I stopped teaching, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, because I wanted to make sure that what I had learned from my students and what they had learned from me sort of got written down. So that was another motivation for me to write this.
Well, you bring up a good point. There are some people who are totally for it and some people who are totally against it. Now, I will say that the people who are totally against it, their biggest argument is, hey, our country is an absolute mess. Why don't we take care of our country first, and then we'll help you out? Case in point, I believe the Biden administration printed $75 billion to give to Ukraine alone in the past 2-3 years. However, the Federal Housing Administration says all it needs is $20 billion to take care of homelessness in the United States. So what are your thoughts on that? Are you in the agreement that, hey, maybe there's some money that could be given to the homeless or maybe the hungry, and then we take care of it? So it's not against it completely, but it's just there are certain priorities that need to be checked off first. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, the U.S. is not the only country in the world that gives foreign aid and foreign assistance. There are lots of countries, richer countries, that give foreign aid and foreign assistance. So it's a much wider discussion.
We are number one, though, right? USA is number one, I believe. They give $550 billion in the past, 8-9 years, $50 billion on average a year. Is that right?
It's getting, at the moment, it's about $50 billion, but that actually is much more. They actually give, if you talk about foreign aid as what I call with a big A, that includes military aid, it includes all kinds of aid to not poor countries, all kinds of things in it. And there, the U.S. is giving about 1% of its income, but maybe a little bit more. But when you get down to just the part that is official assistance to poor countries for development purposes, not military, whatever, it's much smaller. So the amount actually being given to Ukraine in development aid is much smaller than the numbers. Now, realistically, people always say that, why are we giving people abroad when we can do things here? And I couldn't agree more that poverty programs in this country and other kinds of programs rebuilding our infrastructure need more. However, realistically, that money that we're giving for foreign aid is not going to be translated back into the country. It's not an either or situation. It would. I'm not quite sure where it would go, but it wouldn't go there. So I think we have to be careful about saying, well, we could just do this to that. We see how difficult it is in the Congress today to move money, even for just one small little bucket to another small bucket. So it's not realistic to think that we're going to stop doing something and not do another. But that brings us to the purpose of foreign aid, which is really, people think, oh, well, it's because we're being so charitable. But no, it's really for every country, it's a way of furthering their own foreign interests, their own strategic policies, their foreign affairs policy. It's a way of getting their interests completed in the world. And that's true for Japan, it's true for China, it's true for the United States, it's true for Russia. And that brings us to the whole foreign aid question, which is there are a lot of different countries competing for influence in the world with developing countries that are rich in natural resources. Developing countries are the part of the world that we kind of don't know as much about as the rest of the world. We see new developments, new lands opening up. Of course, developing countries are the least responsible for our climate crisis. So there's a lot of opportunity in developing countries. So it's actually very in our own interest to be providing aid and to have friends and influence. And you see this quite clearly, not only from the US side, but from China, which has upped its foreign aid quite tremendously, although it's cutting back a little bit now because, of course, it's economically not in such good shape at the moment. But China has won lots of friends all over the world by foreign aid. Russia, when it got into this unpopular war in Ukraine, started doing more foreign aid around the world because it wants, various countries to become neutral as opposed to, voting against it in the United Nations. So there are lots of reasons. Now, foreign aid, good or bad, if you abstract it from the fact that the money could go somewhere else, or you think it could go somewhere else in the US, there's a lot of reasons to believe that foreign aid as it's practiced today is not helping much. And that's because, first of all, what I just said, that people, they're giving it for different reasons. It's not necessarily because everybody wants people to be less poor, they want children to go to school, they want children to go to health. There's a lot of politics involved with it. There are some very smart people, including Nobel Prize winners, who think that foreign aid actually hurts countries because when you provide money for various projects, you're actually asking the government and working with the governments to be more responsive to the donor than to its people. You're changing the accountability of the government from the people to the donors, who may or may not know anything about the country and who may or may not know anything about the people.
Exactly. That's where I was going, that you're creating enemies within the culture that you're supposed to be helping from an external viewpoint,
Right. And in some cases, now in other cases, the problem with foreign aid is it's not really black or white, because in other cases, foreign aid is actually really doing some very good things. I've seen some very successful projects that really have lifted people out of poverty. I've also seen a lot of failures. So there is that problem too, in addition to, what it's doing kind of to the governments and governance and governing. There's the problem that we always don't know what's the best thing to do. I like to say that if we knew how to resolve poverty, we would have done it a long time ago. It's now there's other smart people like Jeffrey Sachs, who's a noted American economist, who says, well, it's not rocket science. All you have to do is give people seeds and give people education and give people health. But it isn't that easy. There are lots of different incentives involved. There's a lot, poor people are very risk adverse, with very good reason for being risk adverse, because when you have a little bit, you can't afford to lose that little bit.
Mm.
And that's really the story here, is that you have to get down to the grassroots level with this kind of aid. And instead, the arguments and the controversies are really at very high levels. And there's kind of a disconnect between the conversation that's happening in the capitals and what's actually happening on the ground. And that's hard to resolve. It's not an easy problem.
What do you say about the people who analyze foreign aid and they see nothing but corruption? And what that means is they have been given money, but there's all these backhand deals, backdoor deals that lead to individuals, especially politicians or people that are on their side, getting very wealthy. Now, I don't know all the details about this, but there's all kinds of proof and data that show the moment that money went from the United States to Ukraine, a lot of money, not all of it, went into this cryptocurrency, which went right back into the Democrat Party, which, if that's true, that is 100% corruption, which is just crazy. So what would you say about foreign aid? Automatically, there's going to be corruption no matter what, and there's nothing you can do about it, or that just needs more monitored, I guess you could say?
I think there's different kinds of corruption. One is the corruption that really benefits the donor, and there are cases where there are deals made where corruption is actually benefiting private individuals, both on the donor side and on the recipient side, and that unfortunately does happen. And in fact, African countries for a long time have pointed out that it takes two to tango with corruption, and sometimes governments that provide aid are turning a blind eye to it. But on the other hand, there is a lot of corruption, involved in many countries, not all countries, but our data shows clearly that when you're poor and you have very short-term views, even as a government, and a lot of the governments that we deal with in poor countries are not stable governments. So your time frame, you don't have the time frame to be a statesman. You're in office and you're trying to get what little good you can do, possibly on the ground, but also for yourself, because you realize that you'll be out in the next minute, and you could even be in exile, and you got to feed your own family. And so there's very strong motivations. And we also know now that corruption really isn't a case of individuals. It's really, sure, there are individuals who mastermind things and stuff, but it's really a systemic problem that goes through the culture and the way countries are governed and stuff. And so it's very hard to root out. Foreign aid is not exempt from that. There is corruption of foreign aid, but more importantly, there's corruption in the countries that are receiving the foreign aid. And that is a long-term problem that one needs to work on. When I look at some of the data and when I see some of the data, it's very contradictory, because I know that in some countries, people were much more reluctant, for example, to try and steal World Bank money than they were to steal their own government resources, because they didn't want to get in trouble with the bank, et cetera, et cetera. But in other countries, there's a view that, foreign aid, it's not really our money, it's not really doing what we want it to do, so we may as well just take it. But I want to stress that I think that is not the major problem here with aid. I think the corruption views have been overblown. I think there is much more problems of, number one, do we know what we're doing? Not necessarily, nobody has great answers and sort of silver bullets to how to make this money really do what it's supposed to do in every case. That's the first thing. Second thing is, we know we're dealing with very unstable, poor governments with very poor resources, poorly trained staff, little incentives. So, give them a break. They're doing the best they can, kind of. And it's, I've said a few times, and I hate to be so blunt about it, but incompetence is a lot more of a problem than corruption in many ways. But that importantly is something that can be fixed, and that people are trying to do with education, with training, et cetera. So there's some hope for that. The third thing that really messes up the effectiveness of foreign aid, other than do we know what we're doing, and the governments need to be strengthened, is how is the relationship between the donors and the governments? Is it real? Do you have the same objectives? Do you trust one another? Are you involved in this dance that everybody knows isn't going to work and it's just for show? Or are you really trying to get something done? And I've seen it both ways, and the book covers it in both ways. That's why I'm trying to be, other than an advocate for one view or another, I'm trying to show the data and evidence for all different points of view in the book on the controversies, because I think that's important. What's also important is the future and what happens from this point on.
Yeah, I see that in you. It's not that you have an agenda. It seems like you just want to question things to get people to think for themselves, which I respect. And maybe it all begins, like you said, corruption will always be there, but that could potentially be limited if you just start to analyze the politicians that are pushing for things. And I see individuals like the Nikki Haley's and the Lindsey Grahams, they're getting paid by people who want war. So it's like, and it's documented. They become millionaires based off of pushing for more of the military industrial complex, as long as that keeps growing. So
just going to say that.
yeah, what that means is they will create problems so they could be the solution, so they could become the foreign aid provider, which then makes their bank account and their allies' bank account bigger. So their intentions seem like, oh, they want to help, but really what they're doing is lining their pockets. And I think
I
that's
don't know
crucial.
if they're lining their individual pockets, but they're certainly getting influence, and because they have objectives, they want power. I mean, people. So again, I think the extent of individual personal corruption, where people are lining their pockets, in the strict definition, may not be as much as everyone thinks it is in corruption. But you have getting money and friends for influence, and then being able to, use that. I mean, it's the greatest example of this right now is in the Supreme Court, right? You don't have to report it. They just have a voluntary code of ethics that they passed the other day. And what
explain that. I'm actually not familiar with what you're talking about. So please.
well, justice, there's been a number of cases in which justices have had powerful friends, political friends, rich friends, who have given them vacations, and this is mostly with respect to Justice Thomas, but it could be others. His wife was campaigning, for particular political points of view, et cetera, et cetera. She was paid under the table by some organization in Washington. So the question is that influencing the justice at all in the decisions he's making and the way he's voting on the court? Now, he says no, but the fact is a lot of that went unreported. And, it crosses the line. And I would say much more of corruption, or something like corruption, undue influence, whatever you want to call it, is in that line. Much more people getting their interests feathered rather than literally lining their pockets. And now in the developing world, there's some lining of pockets too. There's no question about it.
Yeah, who appointed Justice Thomas? I would like to see that. I don't know who did that one, but
yeah, well, the Biden commission. No.
Of course. Interesting. Yeah. So another argument, and you probably have a lot of data and stats in the book, but U.S., like I said, provides the most. Who else provides a lot? And shouldn't the focus be on other countries to provide more, therefore it's more wholesome? Or does the responsibility remain in the United States simply because we have this capitalistic approach that generates a lot of wealth? We are the land of opportunity and freedom for a reason. So what would you say? Do we need to produce more for the world, or do you think the world needs to catch up to us?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. First of all, there needs to be more for if the developing countries are really gonna and the low income countries are really gonna blossom in the next few years, given and to deal with the twin objectives of climate adaptation and mitigation and poverty reduction, you really there needs to be more money from everybody. So it's not a question of somebody should give less or somebody should give more. Everybody needs to give more. With the US, it's a really interesting question because in dollar amounts, it's giving the most. But when you look at it in official terms as your percentage of GNI, your percentage of gross national income, for years and years and years, the UN and other agencies have recommended a very modest goal of 0.7%, which is less than 1% of your gross national product be given for foreign aid. And that gives proportionality, because if every country does it, then according to your income, you're all equal, right? You know, you're all giving 0.7% of your income, whatever your income is. So you're all doing the same amount of effort. Well, in the case of the United States, it has never been anywhere close to that mark. It is in fact, it's one of the lowest in terms of the percentage of gross national product. So even though it's a huge figure, it's bigger than everyone else, it's not the same level of effort. Other countries, well, virtually every country you could possibly name, Germany, France, even Britain, which has had a severe cut in foreign aid over the last 2 years, Italy, Spain, I mean, it goes on, give a higher percentage of their GNI to aid. Now, there's only 5 countries at the moment who actually reached that 0.7. And they're pretty much all Nordic countries, except for Germany has really ramped up foreign aid in the last few years. And so Germany's in the number 2 spot right now and is really doing what it can. But, you know, there's a lot of, you know, in lay terms, funny business going on with the definition of foreign aid, because the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, sort of the rich countries club, so to speak, OECD, you know, they follow the statistics for aid, and they provide some of the better statistics we have, and you can see that some of the rules they have for what counts as aid are kind of interesting. For example, the first year of refugee costs and migration costs for refugees and asylum seekers is counted as aid. So a lot of aid, when you spend money in your country, sort of developing vaccines that might go to developing countries to low-income countries, that counts as aid too. A lot of aid is spent in the countries themselves. That's the other thing that nobody ever talks about here. But a lot of the US aid is absolutely spent here, because the US, the way it provides its aid is quite different from most countries, because it doesn't, except for small amounts, it doesn't give aid directly to the governments. All of its money is subcontracted to private contractors, most of whom are US nonprofit and profit consultants, who then subcontract others and do the work themselves in the developing countries. So that is not how most other countries operate their foreign aid program. Most other countries give money directly to the governments, understanding there's going to be a problem, there could be problems. But the US is so concerned with the corruption you mentioned, et cetera, it's very reluctant to let go of the funds and put them in government accounts. But, that's again, in layman's terms, screws everything up. Because if a government, okay, fine, you're building 20 schools or 20 health posts, and that's great. But if the government doesn't actually know, it's not in their budget, and I don't know what's going on, then who's providing the money for ongoing maintenance for those buildings? Who's providing the money for the teachers? Who's providing the money for the textbooks? Who's providing the money for the toilets? Nobody. And so that's why you see a lot of foreign aid that doesn't work. The money needs to, be given and put on the government's budget. Now, there are people who say, look, we're going to avoid this altogether, and we're giving, money directly to grassroots on the ground. We give money directly to people, and that, that's fine, and that works some of the time, but it's a very, very tiny amount of foreign assistance. All of this philanthropic assistance, if you took away things that were not official foreign aid, but given by charities and foundations and stuff. If you take away the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from the mix, and maybe the up and coming Bezos Fund, there's not a lot of, it's not a lot of money that's going out directly. And even so, in those cases, and in the case of even Bill and Melinda Gates, a lot of the money is spent in the United States.
Mm.
Given to universities, researchers, think tanks.
So, and when I look at foreign aid and seeing where it goes, I'm able to analyze how a lot of it is actually conflicting with each other. All right. And what I mean by that is there was $6 billion given to Iran, I think, in cash. And then there was a lot of money recently given by the Biden administration to Iran. So when you see who they're supporting, a lot of money, I don't know exactly how much, but went to Palestine, went to Hamas. And obviously our ally is Israel. Now, if money's going from Iran to Hamas and they're using that to fight Israel and we're giving money to Israel, doesn't it conflict? And so we're funding the war basically?
Well, technically, I mean, just technically in the example you use, although I think the general point you're making is a fair one, the example you use, we weren't actually giving money to Iran. We were releasing money that was Iran's money that we had been held, and it's for strictly humanitarian purposes. Now, but nevertheless,
isn't that foreign aid? So I may not understand. That to me sounds like foreign aid.
That's not probably not foreign aid because it was Iran's own money. So it's not, we didn't provide money out of the US government budget. So it's not technically foreign aid. But what you're talking about is very much the case, because we don't fund that. But we fund the United Nations, the World Food Program, the United Nations Refugee Program in Gaza, et cetera, UNRWA. So, we are funding both sides. There's no question.
Yes.
Now, the money we provide to Israel is not technically development aid. It's really it's other kinds of aid, and it's military aid, and it's other kinds of aid, because Israel's not a poor country. We're not trying to help, reduce poverty in Israel by any means. So that, again, that's strictly geopolitical strategic thinking. So, again, a lot of what we do and a lot of what is seen as aid by the public really has nothing to do with this idea of we're helping people. But you're very right that we have, in many places, aid is finding itself supporting both sides of conflict. And in fact, one of the things we do know about poverty reduction, some of the things we don't know so much about, is we do know that basically war is just about the opposite of poverty reduction. It increases poverty, it increases misery, it increases suffering. So anytime, and in fact, that's one of the concern, is that in coming years, most of the poor countries and most of the poor are going to be from conflict situations. So, there are people who say we should be really concentrating on peace as opposed to aid, but very complicated subjects and chicken and egg kind of things.
There's an ideological battle that's happening, and that's what I think foreign aid. I believe that if somebody needs money for food or just needs food in general, right, there's that. But I've seen some of these bills where there's money earmarked to make sure it goes to training their society on transgenderism
Right, exactly.
or that type of lifestyle, when the country or the people are against that. So yeah, helping them is one thing, but you mean you're gonna push your ideas onto us and change our culture? We don't want that, right? So that's what's scary. I've had friends in different countries tell me, do you see what they're trying to do here? It has nothing to do with poverty or keep us safe. It's pushing the Western culture onto us, and we don't want that. So what would you say about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that that is a fair critique of foreign aid. Now, ideally, you would get to situations where objectives are the same and you're not trying to change somebody in your image. There is a lot of that happens, and a
Yes.
lot of reasons for providing aid. The French have provided aid to French West Africa for years and years and years, and it's really because they want, they're no longer colonies, but they want to, protect this image of francophonie, which means the greater French Empire. That it's not just France where they're speaking French, right? And they're all part of our sphere of influence. So, there is a lot of, and foreign aid has a lot of the same motivations that, interestingly, colonialism did. And not only is it about getting natural resources and labor and all the economic things, but it's about, our culture is superior and we think everybody else should have it,
Mm-hmm.
which is um, not helpful at all and should not happen. And that is a big critique of aid. On the other hand, there are interests that I think we can all agree on and that need to be funded. Nobody wants to see their children die. There are lots of citizens in this world who would like to see their governments be responsive, that they understand that governments need to actually work for the people and be effective. There are a lot of things that could happen where we don't have to impose our standards on others. And in fact, when we talk about poverty reduction, there's been a lot of questions about what really leads to a government's committing and doing a good job and moving from low income status to middle income status and really moving out of poverty. And committed leadership is big deal, but the kind of, whether it's democratic or whether it's authoritarian or all kinds, it seems that the type of regime doesn't make much of a difference when you put all the research together, which is really interesting. I mean, the fastest poverty reduction in the world has been China, but then, also very fast, India. Not quite as fast, but it's catching up. Vietnam, again, a socialist country, doing quite well. Other countries that are democratic also doing well. We have Uruguay. Uruguay and Chile, democratic regimes in Latin America, have become the two leading richest countries in Latin America, while some of the others have stagnated, whether they've been Venezuela or they've been Brazil or they've been poor Mexico. So, it's some of our preconceptions that people, they have to be changed as to what is right. And part of that is much more listening. It's almost a cliche, but listening to people,
Hmm.
and having the people who really need the aid, having more decisions over where that aid goes. That's really key to this whole business. But for that to happen, there needs to be a much better, tighter relationship between governments and their people, and between foreign aid donors, governments, and those people. And right now, it's very scattered, because there's so many donors, there's so many needs, there's so many controversies. Now people are trying to say that there's a split between giving money for climate adaptation and mitigation, giving climate for poverty reduction, and there are some trade-offs, how fast you get out of fossil fuels, what you let developing countries and low-income countries do. So there are some trade-offs, but in the end, if unless we are doing these simultaneously, and together as joint goals, the situation is going to become intolerable on this planet. So
Right.
we need to keep working. And so so that's why, in the end of the day, I'm a bit dismayed about foreign aid, because I think it can do some good things. In order to do as much as it needs to do, there needs to be more, which is going to be a very hard sell. And the fact of the matter is, there needs to be lots of changes, some of the ones that we discussed here today. But change is going to be really difficult, because, as you have rightly said, there are people pushing in this direction, people pushing in this direction. So what happens? You get a stable system, a stable, not so good system. And that's what we have.
Yeah, I don't believe the USA should be the policeman for every country. There are some countries that just want to be left alone, and for us to impose our beliefs on every culture, it just shows that you're creating enemies that way. Let the countries do what they want, and if they, get into a war like Israel with Hamas, hey, Israel, yeah, you got our back. Fight them, fight back and all that. But you know, why is it on us to provide money everywhere if there's a problem? And I think that creates a lot of enemies, but also a lot of corruption comes from it. And I also see how they play the games in politics. Hey, like Trump, if he turned down a foreign aid package, within the package was an earmark for something. And all he has to say is, take that out. I don't want that in there. You could send it, but we got to take that out. And then the other people on the other side of the aisle will say, well, he's turning down this because he doesn't care about that country. When all it is semantics and just a game that's being played. And it's pretty scary to see, because where does it end? But that's
I have
phenomenal.
to say, you can't take the US really as the shining example, because in my opinion, it has one of the poorest foreign aid machines and ways of doing business among all the donors. So, I just want to add that caveat, that the US is not a shining example. We have other countries like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Britain before the current government, and even Germany, that I think you could argue have done a better job. Not a great job, but a better job. And and of course there's China, which has also done a very mixed job, but has been very helpful in counterbalancing some of that influence, and saying, you don't need to go to the US for this, or you don't need to go to the World Bank. We'll fund that. But there's no such thing as a free lunch. I always used to tell that to the officials I was working with. And I think we all have to remember that there's, people have to answer, as you said, to their constituents. We all have opinions about where US foreign aid should go, or whether it should go or it shouldn't go. And you have to be accountable. So it is a tough, complicated business, which is why it's good to read the book.
I do recommend it. You've opened my eyes to a few things I got to look into. It's interesting. And I believe it all starts with the politicians, me personally. That's just my belief pattern. And there's only one president in the past 100 years that got into office and his net worth went down. Do you know who that is?
No.
Oh, okay. It's Donald Trump. His net
Of
worth.
course, I figured you were going to say Trump, but um, have nothing to say about Donald Trump. Absolutely nothing to say. In fact, I can say definitively that he has been talk about wanting to impose your views on other countries. Oh my God. And, you know, and having a disrespect for every other citizen and country in the world. Oh my God. So, you know, definitely, you know, all I can say is if his net worth went down, it was probably a good thing.
Well, we're gonna have to disagree on that, but I think we can save that for another conversation because
Okay.
the way I look at it, if a politician goes in as a regular lower middle class individual and becomes a millionaire within a year or 2 or 3 years, it shows a sign of corruption. So I look at that as like, all right, we got to fix that. Nancy Pelosi made $179,000 at her highest point, and she has a net worth of 120 million. Come on, there's got to be something going on there. So anyway, it starts with the politicians, and that's the way I look at it. But man, this has been interesting. Foreign aid. I have never had an in-depth conversation on $1 million stories like that. So I really appreciate your time. The book is very well done. And guys, pick it up. It is Foreign Aid. It is just came out. Phyllis Pomerantz. Thank you so much for being here.
Practice.
What's that?
Yeah, I said it just came out. Please.
Just came. Policy and Practice. Guys, grab it and get in touch with you. Any website, any social media you recommend, or just get the book?
Get the book. I can always be reached through Duke University because I am still a professor emerita at Duke.
Oh, very nice. It's been excellent to talk with you. And remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.